Want to start a podcast, or are you already a podcast host? What would you say if I told you that you can get paid up to $31 per guest you interview, and I can help you book those guests? If you want to start making more money with your podcast right now and interview great guests who your listeners will love, it's not too good to be true. It's Podmatch. If you use my Podmatch link in the show notes right now, Podmatch will pay you up to $31 per interview. Yes, up to $31 per interview. I did not stutter. If you want to make more money from your podcast while expanding your reach and getting more listeners, simply click our Podmatch link in the show notes right now to check out this really cool opportunity. Welcome back to the Podgasm Marketing Podcast. I'm your host, Brian Fleming, and today I'm going to share with you these 3 brand messaging mistakes that will kill your podcast. So in other words, don't do them. Before I get to that, I want you to be sure you grab the free Speak Your Listeners Language PDF. It's a simple 3-page PDF that's going to show you 7 super simple keys to easily crafting a powerful brand message for your podcast that will make it more appealing to more of the right people so your show will grow. So if you want more people to notice your podcast more often and subscribe to it, go grab that right now. It's free. I'm not charging anything for it. Everything I say will make a lot more sense once you have this. So click that link in the show notes that says Speak Your Listeners Language right now. So a lot of new podcasters start out really excited and fired up. Most of us do. But then after a while, they make these 3 big mistakes I'm going to share with you today, and they don't see the results they want. They wonder if anyone's even listening. They aren't getting much or any feedback. And so they get frustrated and end up giving up and quitting. That's like the majority of podcasts, but that doesn't have to be you. Avoid these things I'm going to tell you today. So I'm going to teach you 3 of the biggest mistakes new podcasters make that cause them to fail. Again, so you can avoid them. Don't become one of them. If we know what makes people fail, let's just make sure we're not doing those things. What I'm about to teach you in a minute will be the difference between success and failure for your podcast. And let me ask you this really quick, fellow podcaster. Are you looking for an easy way to record your podcast episodes in world-class high quality, edit them in a flash, and make them live without all the technical headaches and confusion? If so, then you're in luck. Riverside FM is the premier podcast recording software that allows you to produce the same high-quality podcasts as other world-famous podcasters your listeners are already enjoying. Look, level up your podcast right now, even if you're brand new, you're not a techie, maybe you don't have a lot of time, so you can attract more listeners to your podcast consistently. This thing has AI software built into it that can cut clips from your podcast and do in 5 seconds what it would take you 5 hours to do, so you can share those to social media and get more exposure and grow your following. So look, simply click the Riverside FM link in the show notes to grow your podcast to the next level, starting right now. So here's the first mistake. Your podcast is not about solving one big, particular, specific problem. You have too many diverse topics. Let's say you talk about health, and that's like for everyone, from babies to toddlers to kids to teens, adults, seniors, middle-aged, whatever people. But you also talk about money. Oh, well, what do you talk about? Saving money, making money, profit and loss statements, paying your taxes, saving money on taxes, all things money. Oh, but then you talk about faith because you're religious and all the things that go in with that. Oh, but then you also talk about relationships. You talk about having a great relationship. Oh, don't forget overcoming adversity. People are looking, the people are not looking for jacks of all trades online nowadays. That only works if you have an existing and or large following who already knows and likes you. Say, well, Joe Rogan talks about a lot of stuff. Yeah, he's the biggest podcast in the world. That's different. Oprah talks about a lot of stuff. Yeah, she's already famous. That's different. When you're starting out, the best way to get attention is to address one big problem people have. And if you're not doing that, people are not noticing you. And the thing about this is that most new podcasters, it seems in my experience, do this. They just generalize everything. So when you do that, you're literally doing what everyone else is doing and blending in with everyone else doing it wrong. So don't do that. Make sure your podcast is not about, avoid making your podcast about not solving one big problem. Now, the second mistake people make is you don't talk about your listeners' enemies enough, the problems and things that hold them back, what's stopping them, keeping them stuck. And then the third mistake is this. You don't speak to the propaganda, going through their heads caused by the enemies and problems that they have in their lives. Now, if you don't know what I mean by that, again, go back and listen to episodes 1 through 8 to very easily clarify this for your podcast so your listeners will connect on a deeper level with you and listen more. I keep these podcast episodes short for a reason, so you can get through all of them. So when I say go listen to episodes 1 to 8, that won't take you very long because I keep most of these pretty much under 10 minutes. So let's take this podcast, for example. The problem I help new podcasters just like you overcome is having a show that doesn't grow. And I happen to do that in a unique way by showing podcasters like yourselves how to talk about what you do from a place of clear and compelling value. Number 2, on this podcast, I'm constantly talking about problems, enemies that cause new podcasters like you to struggle. And I do it, again, according to the unique way that I help and add value. And addressing the third kind of mistake, on this podcast, I'm constantly speaking to the propaganda. This is what I'm doing right, by the way. These are examples of me not making these mistakes. On this podcast, I'm constantly speaking to the propaganda, the emotional feelings and struggles that my ideal audience, new podcasters, deal with as they struggle to make their podcast a success. I talk about I talk about feeling stuck and frustrated and burned out and hopeless and just wondering if anything's going to work. I talk about those things because when we talk about how people feel, they pay more attention to us. So think about this. Let's apply this to your podcast. Does your podcast brand messaging speak to a clearly defined enemy, the problem your listeners deal with? And are you addressing, secondly, the enemies they face, the problems holding them back? Third, does your podcast brand messaging across the board address the propaganda in your ideal listeners' heads, addressing their feelings and thoughts and emotions and the stories going through their heads caused by the enemies and problems they're facing? Look, answer these 3 questions for your podcast. Write them down. If you're driving, don't write them down. Write them down if you can. Type them down, voice text them, whatever. Write them down so you can stop struggling to get and retain listeners so your show will continue to grow. Your podcast matters. And look, if you know another podcaster this podcast episode can help, please share it with them. Just click the share button. It takes about 3 seconds and help me to help them in the same way I'm trying to help you today. Do you struggle to write compelling and effective brand messaging that gets your podcast noticed? Do you want more people to listen to your podcast, but you struggle to talk about it in a way that grabs their attention and keeps it? If your podcast marketing messaging is not up to par, you are losing listeners. But maybe you don't know anything about copywriting and writing marketing messaging and such. Fortunately for you, I've been doing it for over 17 years. Do you want me to write your podcast marketing messaging for you in a clear, powerful, and compelling way that grabs your ideal listeners' attention and makes them want to listen to your podcast over and over again? Each month, I take on a small, limited number of clients and rewrite their podcast marketing messaging for them. Yes, I do all the hard work for you, and you just get to enjoy the benefits of it without any of the headaches when I'm done. If you want me to craft clear, distinct, and compelling marketing messaging that grows your podcast for you so you can attract more listeners consistently, send me an email right now at podgasmshow@gmail.com. There's a link in the show notes. And put the word consult in the subject line to check my availability.